And
1 second.
Okay.
All right, whenever you're ready.
All right, we're live. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Digital Culture Speaker Series. I'm Todd Ingalls, Associate Director here at the School of Arts, Media, and Engineering. And I would first like to take a moment to acknowledge the land that this is being hosted on by playing this video land acknowledgement.
Arizona is home to 22 indigenous tribes.
Arizona State University's campuses are situated on the homelands of many tribal nations.
In particular, the A'atam
and Peepash, and acknowledge the many indigenous communities who reside in this territory.
Skigik is the O'odham word that is now known as Phoenix, which was settled in 1881 by occupiers.
The ancestors of the A'atam, the Huhugam, created canals and utilized surrounding rivers that are the basis of the current irrigation system that feeds Skigik today.
These waterways have always been the foundation and livelihood of the residents within the valley. Throughout the past 500 years, the impact of colonialism have been detrimental to indigenous lands and languages, affecting their livelihood.
Many people who live in the Southwest are unaware of this history. Furthermore, ASU's indigenous student community consists of over 3,000 strong,
not including faculty, staff, and alumni, who continue to thrive, educate, and advocate for the strengthening of indigenous ways of life.
As the O'odham call it, Himdak, the way of life for the O'odham, encompassing their culture, traditions, identity, and being. As O'odham and indigenous peoples,
our identity is tied to the land. Like our own bodies, we must respect and care for it, and we urge everyone to do the same.
We challenge you to educate yourself about the history and the communities who continue to thrive today.
Moving forward, it is vital to honor and respect
that you are always
on indigenous land.
All right, thank you, everyone. So our guest today is Chloe Alexandra Thompson, who is joining us from Brooklyn right now. And so everyone can read the bio that was sent out. I just wanted to say, I think I met Chloe in some online spaces and was impressed with her work and the range of activities that she's pursuing, and thought it would be great to have her come and speak at our series, again, give some insights to our students about the type of work that she's doing. I also, you may also recognize her, some of you from recent Cycling 74 press. She's also one of the first groups of MAC certified trainers, along with our own Andrew Robinson as well is in that class, and maybe she'll speak briefly about that as well. But I'm going to go ahead and turn it over, and everyone please welcome Chloe, and thank you.
Thank you, Todd. I'm just going to take a moment to share my screen. Yeah. So hello and thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this series. It's really amazing. And I really want to thank everyone who's here today. I hope that this talk does bring some form of connection and inspiration to you as students and faculty and community members, especially in a time where making, learning, and engaging in artistic practices can be quite isolating. I just want to preface with something before I open the talk. While I'm an artist, I also have had and continue to have many roles, as Todd mentioned. I could probably spend the length of this talk listing the specifics of all those roles, but I think you could gather a lot of it based on my website and my LinkedIn. Toward the end of the talk, I will briefly discuss how my work in the context of being an artist working for a living, and how in my experience, this has been so dependent on having a multiplicity of skill sets. And I want to invite you to consider any questions you might have in that regard. Anything around the work that's more visible, such as my certified training or my work in arts administration and as a technologist alongside being an artist. Yes, please. I think that's one of the most important things about exchanges like this is taking practical knowledge and having that coincide with all of the theory that you're getting in your classes. So with that, I'm going to begin. In this talk, I'm going to focus on two common threads that link throughout all my work across every role I do, which is space, be it physical or virtual, and interaction. I'm going to discuss practical applications of theory in using sound as my primary focus. For me, these practices of interaction and observation are applicable across all mediums. So if I'm talking about listening, you can totally apply that to sight, to light, to anything. And I'm going to open with a very short sample of work to give you about 1 minute of context before we begin. So I make computer music and interactive computer-based systems. I generate and control sounds using Max as an instrument primarily. And when I work as a sound designer with other artists, I often use and create Max for Live devices for ease of use. We collectively, as part of digital arts, probably are familiar with these workflows. So I'm not really going to talk a lot about that. Something I believe that is of more intermediate importance in this work is our bodies and ourselves and our senses experienced through the physicality of the spaces we inhabit. This feels especially important during this pandemic time when we may not be able to access spaces for performance or practice or the typical groups of people we're used to being in. Prior to arriving in a new space or venue, I work with technical staff to go over an advance, which is where like I tend to place my speakers roughly and find out what I'm actually going to be working with so I can tailor the work in advance. Every space will sound different. I've made music in all of these spaces and more, and you can tell from the photos and the videos, they're all of different sizes. The peak of the curvature of the Loyola Chapel, which is in that video, is 75 feet. And the way that it's designed, the sound travels from side to side in this really beautiful way. The Neptune, which is also in the video portion, has a balcony, and that's totally a bass trap. The Cube is an acoustically treated 4-story high-density loudspeaker array. And the Witzel on the top left is a theater primarily used to showcase cinema. It might seem entirely obvious, especially if you've toured a show, but I want to take this time to acknowledge and reframe the space as an influence, collaborator, and force to be integrated. I will share a short story to touch on the more practical aspects of this. A few years ago, I was presenting an audiovisual work at the Whitsaw at the Portland Art Museum, and it was quadraphonic. When I arrived in the space, the entire piece was tuned to the resonant frequency of the room. So a large portion of the chords and the notes I was using would output at nearly double their intended amplitude. I work with a lot of sine waves, and so this happens. Some venues have like an EQ or a limiter set across the board to attenuate these sorts of acoustic phenomenon. In this case, the Meyer PA had been brought in for the performance, so that hadn't happened, which is actually great in my opinion. In my work, I like to play and experiment with those artifacts, so I prefer not to use a limiter. And so in this case, I retuned the piece over the course of the day to work with the architectural artifacts. And you'll note that I'm using the term ears in this slide, saying ears traveling with space. Until recently, I've intentionally limited my work to performance. This is due to the fact that I do work with a lot of psychoacoustic phenomenon and consider the space and listening conditions to be an important experience of the composition. I am speaking and will speak a lot about sound in this context, as I sort of prefaced before. But I do totally believe that sound is physical and experienced physically. And these practices are also sculptural. And to an effect, the way that I'm using sound in space is somewhat related to sculpture, especially within the realm of spatial audio or wave field synthesis. And if I can leave you with one thing of importance today as artists, is that you're always surrounded by your medium, no matter what it is. An exercise I'd like to encourage you to try in working with space and sound, or really if you're feeling isolated from your surroundings in this time, is to clap or snap your fingers when you enter a new room. What are you doing? What you're doing there is using your ears to measure a rough impulse of the space. If you're then to like sing a scale or sweep a sine wave across an entire frequency range at equal amplitude and listen to which notes sound louder in the reflection, you would be finding the resonant frequency of the space. You can also do this by recording that sound onto a microphone or a voice memo. If you put that in the center of the room, you'd be doing something very similar to what is done to create convolution reverbs. I want to encourage you to think of galleries, tunnels, natural spaces, displays in this embodied way, and to gain confidence playing in the world, measuring sound reflections or light reflections. This is how new technologies are created. And I really hope that this sounds so cheesy, but you can like let those echoes influence your practice. Each space will be different. Every venue that I've played at has influenced my work in some way, and that also includes audience. And there are differences to how sound and art may be performed, presented, or gifted in a space, and those extend beyond the physicality of the space, which is what I've primarily focused on. As a worldview and as a Cree person, these experiences are also part of my, or these other experiences are also part of my consideration of space as an important collaborator. Each space has a voice, and it's my responsibility as a listener to find and work with that voice in a respectful way. In brief, and on this note, by encouraging this sort of focused listening, I think a comparison to deep listening is like the easiest sort of shorthand. It can help with your field recording or your video making. I want to encourage you to sit with the sounds you're hearing in the foreground when you're in the field or performance space, and let yourself experience what is beyond the sound and reach your senses out as far as they can go. We're often drawn to focus on one sound or an image that we want to capture. But in that sort of searching passion, what we might miss is that a car drove through, wrecking the audio take, or if you're shooting and focusing through glass, you might miss your own reflection. By becoming more open to listening and to fully experiencing space and expanding our ear and eye systems outside of this sort of purely object-based relationship, our choices can become more intentional and easier to sort of interrogate or track. This is something that is a huge part of group performance or improv. When you're playing in that way, as most of us probably know, it's not just about getting a part right, it's about this exchange of listening and feeling, and sort of a full body movement. And this brings us to interaction. I've just clarified a more sort of site-specific or what might be considered inherent modes of interaction, specifically with space. As it turns out, except for those 10 minutes before performing in front of a big room, when that whole stage fright thing hits, we as artists hope people will engage with our work. We want an audience. That's part of why we do this. Let's discuss the possibilities for audience interaction. I'm going to name a few kind of more analog modes related to spatial audio or psychoacoustics before moving on to sensors and the online forms of interaction that I've been using. And so spatial audio is inherently interactive. Here's a 32.2 channel array called Unity Gain. It is owned by Portland Community College. I've performed on it. It's existed in different configurations. And here you can see we are all doing it wrong. The speakers are all set to have the listener be at head height, but everyone is on the floor, and this will happen. I like to encourage my audience to walk around a room. In spatial audio, there's a tendency to focus the listener into the center of the room. And so there's these 10 people in a cluster that all get to have this perfect experience, and then everyone else is having some other experience. But I think one of the really great things about working with multi-channel audio is that the viewer or the participant really is creating artifacts by moving through it and also deciding and chasing their own experience. And so it's inherently interactive. Same for this space. This is a 148 channel array set up in a 3D array configuration. I believe there's 5 subwoofers, if I recall correctly. And so clearly you're going to have a different sonic experience in different parts of this room. This array is quite acoustically treated, and one of the great things to do is to load in an impulse response or convolution reverb and apply that, kind of mix in about 50% of it, and make this room sound like something else. It's super fun to play with. And one of the other sort of modes of spatial interaction that always comes to mind for me is Dreamhouse, an installation that started in 1993 by Lamont Young. And it's all based on difference tones. So when you're stagnant in the space or still, all you hear is a drone. But if you move your head 1 inch, you just get this epic sine wave shimmer. And so that's another way that people can interact with your work if you're playing microtonally or these other ways. Basically, what I'm trying to hammer home here is that everything is interactive. With wave field synthesis, like all of these other forms of spatial audio are kind of not a democratized, I've been talking, it's more like an individualist way of being, but I feel like wave field synthesis is really the most individually focused. It's technically not ambisonic because it's only a 2-axis sound relationship. You operate on an XY value with this type of array. Typically it's mounted horizontally. It's meant to recreate how sounds would travel in the natural world. And it's in this context, I was doing a spatial arrangement for the artist James Alistair Sprang during Toward turning toward a radical listening at the kitchen. So we had 8 speakers in the round around the audience, and this was mounted on the ceiling overhead. And how the seating was placed underneath it, each chair was a meter apart. And I could place a sound that would be the only thing that someone could hear in the 6th row. And the person in the 8th row would have no idea that was going on. So it's really these you can create these hyper localized sound holograms that you actually feel. It's very creepy. But it's super fun to play with. But again, it's this very like individuated thing. And when it's mounted in a space that you're freely allowed to move in, of course, you can interact with it. So to interactive media, we've clearly been talking about interactivity this whole time, but now I really want to focus a bit more on user participation through these more hardware tools that we have access to as people working within the digital arts. I think both are equally important, and to fully understand the implications of working interactively with your audience and with spaces really opens up this door to creating more holistic and adventurous ways of interacting when you start mediating that interaction. So I'm going to play this video. This is an example of my movements being captured by 2 Intel RealSense depth cameras, and they're being rendered in real time into a Unity scene that's part of a collaborative project with my friend Acoustic Stalemate. The combination of the 2 cameras, one is a webcam with IR, and then the other one is doing strictly tracking using SLAM or simultaneous localization and mapping. So this creates essentially like a 3D scan of the front half of my body. This was filmed sitting in this chair as a camera test. And you can see when the Unity camera turns, you can see part of my head, but I haven't actually moved my body. The camera was mounted about where you are right now, which is why I chose this video. The spatial information is then being melded with the color info from the camera to create this particle field that's made up of my 3D information. And when I move quickly, the particles scatter because of the physics that engine has applied forces to them. And I'm really excited to work with this system with dancers after the pandemic to create more, I guess, integrated forms of score collaboration. Similar tracking mechanisms exist within new iPhone cameras. This is how Animoji works to some extent with face detection. They're not as dense as this one. Kinetic and other forms of motion tracking cameras have been around for a while. The motion, so this is really nothing new, but I do think as these technologies continue to become more higher res and exact, they give such a strong potential for collaborative work across movement, audio, and visual practices, which would be building upon a legacy that exists and is also amazing. One part of my practice that I've always been investigating is how to make forms of instrumentation removed from more typical, like musically trained practices. I found that so many people are concerned about starting to use Macs or any form of music or synthesis. But I also believe inherently nearly every single person understands sound. We feel and often hear a heartbeat as our first sense before being born. And music theory is made up of essentially our reactions and responses to sound. There are nearly boundless potentials for interaction across sensors, microcontrollers, and online information that it reads to me as a perfect entry point to encourage enjoyable and accessible interactions with sound. I want to briefly touch on a couple of projects using slider controls on the internet that I've been a part of during this pandemic. The first was designed by myself and a collaborator named Johnny Ray Alt. It's called Haptic Paradigm, and It features, this kind of collection features visuals by Brenna. This few were visuals by, first was Brenna Murphy of Mesher, and the second was Divya Moran. And there will be more of these coming up. Another project that I've been a part of over quarantine was an installation, or is, it's presently still happening, by CM van Halswolf. It's a collaboration of 82 different artists, I believe. And Randall Dunn, who's an amazing producer, and I collaborated on this one portion of it, and I'm going to play a little excerpt from it. And so one of the things that I really like about this piece in particular, and the use of sliders, is that you don't necessarily need to know much about what these frequencies mean to interact with them, and you also get to learn about them if you don't already know. I think that using slider controls in these ways creates a really encouraging environment. When we were working on haptic paradigm, from the samples that we were talking about with Brenna's piece, we wanted to make the user interaction as like obvious as possible. So it became this like hyper playable instrument, but also there was enough changeability that it wasn't totally boring. And then with DB and Morin, we were more concentrated on kind of taking this approach of ambiguity to the controls. And so it is this really interesting way to engage in a participatory relationship. One of the reasons why I haven't really talked about like ultrasonic rangefinder sensors or light sensors or these other things in like an acousmatic gallery setting, which I also use, is because in this pandemic, there's kind of a lack of being able to do that. And I think we have this really amazing opportunity to use the tools at our hands to create something that is like, it has a life of its own and it is engaging on the same level, but in a totally different way. And if and when we are able to do that and reintegrate that into our practices, once this is all over, we can probably do some pretty amazing things. And I just want to touch on this really briefly, but I really feel that there's such an important and really ripe opportunity to use the skills that we all have to create more accessible instruments, both to people who don't have like a musical knowledge and to people who might not have the muscle density to make a chord on a guitar. We have so many amazing tools that can make accessible, like truly accessible instrumentation between motion tracking and facial recognition and just all of these different things. I really am trying to integrate more into my practice coming from a place of accessibility, and also want to encourage you to consider these questions and these amazing tools that we have to be able to create a more inclusive space. And here's something funny clip art, because I'm like that. Before closing, I do want to address something that I mentioned before we got started. I've been part of the arts for many years in various roles. I was a director of IT, administrator, technician, artist, curator, and audience member. I will mention that as a full-time artist, I still inhabit all of these roles. I might have more roles now. I'm an administrator in writing and maintaining grants, schedules, academic engagements, a technician as a contractor for supplementary income, and I also build my own systems for art. I'm an artist and a curator and who I choose to work with collaboratively. I've run project spaces. I feel that in my work producing, arrangement is also a form of curation in what a final work ends up being. And I'm an audience member in the community. And I think this is the most important role that I actually have is as artists, we are our community, and the connections that we have interpersonally are, at least for me, like how I make my work. I don't find my inspiration on an island. I often find it in somewhat mundane conversations on a daily basis. And our networks are how we like all can lift each other up. And so one thing I really want to talk about is, well, trying to maintain a living as like an early career or emerging artist, it's so important to have some flexibility and to really think about how your skills, or at least in my experience, my skills can be applicable in a flexible way, if that makes sense. Milford Graves used to say to his students, get yourself a skill for when the gigs don't come. And I think that is so important. Even though I've received grants and residencies, I still supplement my practice with making work outside of art directly. And given the lack of funding in the US specifically, I think it's an important thing to keep in mind. So yeah, thank you so much for coming today. And I want to open it up if there's any questions.
Thank you. I don't know if people want to post questions in the chat. And obviously, again, thank you, Chloe. If people have some questions, maybe indicate in the chat so we can start a stack kind of thing, or if people want to type their questions into the chat. While people are doing that, let me go ahead and ask a question while people are maybe formulating those. You use the term artists, you use the terms artists and technologists in your intro, and of course you've also used some other terms about like kind of what your roles are. And I've never known what to kind of make about some of these terms, technologists and things, but I mean I've certainly been in that position, and being in a position of artists and these other things myself. How do you keep these separate in your working life, in particular when and this resonated with me. I mean, this is very much, I think, how I work, where, you know, my ideas that I have come through the conversations with other people and working with other people, not as an isolated person. So kind of how do you know what I'm saying? How do you keep these things separate so that you're clear on kind of the role that you're in?
I mean, I think that really depends on the day. The code switching thing is really real in a lot of different ways. And I just from how I grew up, have been fairly good at that. But I mean, I guess actually last night, I led the Max meetup, and I'd worked on Keynote all day, and I've primarily been mixing this week and doing composition. And when I'm playing music, I tend not to futz with my max patches so much. Like I really just want to play with them. I might make tweaks, but I don't always play and compose at the same time. Or what should I say? I don't always compose and write new patches at the same time. That happens actually very rarely. There's a lot of left-right brain switching. And I got to the Max meetup and I was looking at patches and it was like I'd never seen the program. But it was also 9 p.m., you know, it was late, so it was a little harder to shift into that mode. But I do think it's really important to like block out time for these breaks. And really, I switch through a lot of different positions or ways of making every day, but sometimes it just takes a little longer. And when you are doing so many different things, it's important to keep at least 3 of the deadlines far enough out that you have your own personal flexibility. At least in my experience, like some days I book the day to compose and all I want to do is work on engineering the system for the venue or this other thing that has to do with like technical work, and I just have the bug in my brain, or I just want to write the grant. And I try to maintain and work ahead enough that I have the flexibility to be able to shift those days. When you start doing all of that, if you wait till the day before the deadline, it gets really difficult because then you have to produce, and having that pressure to produce, especially in a time like this with the pandemic, it's definitely I think better to just try to work ahead as much as possible and like keep that deadline at bay, pretend it's a month later, earlier, or later, or whatever.
What about like, you know, let's say you're working on a project as kind of a technologist or something for someone else. It's someone else's main idea that they're, and then, you know, you obviously invest a lot of time and mental energy into thinking through though, you know, what's happening there and what you're supposed to be doing. And then, you know, then when you have to switch to like your own work or work that's coming from like maybe you're leading, you find that you can do both of those things at the same time. It's just, as you're saying, it's a matter of sort of scheduling things in blocks, or is it, yeah.
I mean, it really just depends. I try to, if I'm going to be doing something artistically, I try to focus on one artistic project a day. And then if I'm going to put something else in there, it's grant writing. But I also have done what you've talked about. Typically, when I've been working with and for other people, I tend to work like on artistic projects or collaborations. I'll tend to work like a 10 to 14 hour day. So I might get like an hour or 2 of my own work in on top of that. But by that point, I'm already kind of turned off, if that makes sense. Like
Yeah.
I've already detached a little bit at some point of transit in there. So it's a little easier to switch. But yeah, I think it's important to like block off sort of sections of time. And if I'm like producing somebody's album, that's basically what I'm going to be working on for that week or 2 weeks. And I can sneak things in the evening, but I don't set a deadline to expect myself to do that unless I really have to, if that makes any sense.
Right. Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. So Xavier has a question here. They ask, how do you personally determine what tools are valuable to focus on or not? Clearly, we all have our favorites, so that determined to keep up.
You froze for a second.
Okay. Should I reread that? Or you can see it in the chat.
Yeah, I can see it, and I'm sure I can answer it in a way that people can hear if they're outside this room. How do you personally determine what tools are valuable to focus on? Yeah, so that it really is on a project per project basis. Like I kind of have my I think the main tool in the shed I keep sharp is Max. And then I feel like everything else is pretty figure outable, if that makes sense. Like digital audio workstations all have their own hotkeys and their own shortcuts and their own strengths. But if I'm working in Pro Tools or Logic or Ableton, there's going to be things that I do in those spaces that are all very different. I do all of my recording and mixing in a Pro Tools environment. But I will use the same logic across all three of those platforms. So I might get rusty, but it's pretty easy to switch if you know the basis of one. And yeah, it really depends on what I want to do, but I feel like with Arduino stuff, it's always been easy for me to like pick that back up after a little bit of time off. And yeah, it's really, I kind of already am in a pretty focused area maybe. So I already have that tool set defined. Like I'm not learning Super Collider right now, if that makes sense. Like I've dabbled, but I'm not invested. And I think that's partly just because of where I'm at. I'm open to things, but I'm interested in the flexibility of the tools that I'm using presently enough to stay focused on them. I am also interested in Faust. Yeah, there's endless things that you can do basically. And I think all of the different ways that you can create are completely and totally valid. And it's just a personal choice. I see another question in there.
I can go ahead and read it. If this is from Shomit. So he said, you mentioned accessibility and democratization. You have a strong degree of control in the internal spaces you showed. Could you describe how you approach external or more chaotic, feral, improvisational public spaces?
Yeah, so that really depends. I'm trying to think of a good example right now. I did an installation in a gallery where it was a little like what I was describing with Dreamhouse. It had a little bit of that vibe. There's a lot of difference tones involved, so there's sine wave shimmer. But if people moved in certain areas, it would change what was happening, and it was actually pretty erratic because it was a small space and there was actually a lot of people who came and were moving around in it. And it did some things that I didn't necessarily expect, partly because people moved more than I expected. And then also once people realized there's sensors, it's a thing. I also worked on this public art project a little bit, and it's interesting because as soon as you involve sensors or people realize there's interactivity, everyone tries to break it in this way. But the kind of interactions that come from that are really beautiful. Like in this context, there was a bunch of sensors in a circle, and if you walked by, something lit up, and there was some music that happened as well. It was made in pure data, and people all like linked arms and stood in front of sensors for a really long time, and it made the computers very angry. There was a lot of these sensors and a lot of computational work going on. But even the artifacts that were created there were really pretty, and it was just this like, how often do you see strangers holding hands in public? It's actually like really beautiful. So yeah, I'm really interested in getting to do more projects that involve as people taking something that I've kind of decided is like interactive and then breaking it. And I also, once this is all over, I'm excited to have more live improv because it's also been historically a part of my practice, is playing with musicians that don't make computer music or people who are dancers who don't make music at all. and letting them move my practice, and also letting them make decisions and focusing it more on what they're doing, if that makes sense. So yeah, I am really excited to have more actual interactions with people again. But yeah, I also, on the internal spaces, like the online spaces, there is actually a lot of control. It was part of the project, specifically with, both of them were a part of creating these kind of intentional online spaces, if that makes sense. So they are pretty controlled, and I'm excited to make something in the future with that that is more user defined and singular. Because this was, I think I actually forgot to mention, everyone took a turn, and so it wasn't a single, it was a single thread application. It wasn't everyone having that thing play and interacting with it separately. So everyone was interacting with the same thing and waiting in a like a live stream environment. So it was more like a gallery installation, which is great because then people would essentially take solos and pass it on. It was like kind of a cloutless community, like anonymous community oriented environment. But yeah, I'm gonna stop talking unless you have more questions.
Well, so you, I remember there was I think like a prototype session or something that did even in that, were people doing something that surprised you in their behavior you weren't expecting someone to do?
Are there any questions so far? I think now the question for you all is going to be, how are you going to be creative? How are you going to think around the possibilities?
Robert?
That was my voice coming from somebody else's microphone, which was very odd to hear and sped up.
Okay, that was very, very strange. Okay. So in that environment, even, did people do anything that was surprising to you, unexpected?
Yes, actually, it was, the first one was all about like consider each other in the space. It was like all in the promotional material, and then certain people they were actually texting me and camping out. They were really into it, and instead of opening the live stream in a separate window, stayed on the site. And the whole point was, you're in a queue if you're on the website, and so it goes around in a circle. So people were like laying on the ground listening to this thing and enjoying it a lot, but subsequently other people couldn't take turns. And I forgot, I was like, oh wait, yeah, this happens because people are just like really into a thing, which is like, it's actually the end goal that you want, is people to like your thing. But then if they were texting, and just be like, yo, open in a new window, please. But yeah, I didn't expect camping behavior, but that's like the number one thing to expect on the internet.
Yeah, Showman, go ahead. You can, I think you can unmute your.
Hello. Thanks for a really awesome talk. Very interesting stuff. I'm kind of curious, you know, Max Newhouse's work that's in Times Square. So I used to like run around that area all the time, and I had no idea I was actually experiencing, you know, Times Square until just last year when it came up in one of Dr. Hayes's class. And I'm kind of curious about your thoughts on like this subconscious affecting of people with at a place where like maybe it's not perceptible, the changes that might be occurring according to like how you treat an environment.
I love that question. Thank you. Yeah, that one in particular, I've always, now that I know where it is, and I've visited it and I've been in New York, whenever I end up going near that area, I always look to see if people are gathered around it. And I've always noticed that people are sitting there either quietly or like blasting a boombox, which might also just be Times Square. But particularly there, especially in this time where like Times Square has been relatively empty, people gather there. And it's really been sort of an interesting thing to see that and pass. And I do think that people are drawn to that sound, especially Times Square has been really quiet, and that's really weird actually. Now it's a little different because it's becoming, everyone's out more. Well, I guess I haven't been there since it snowed. But lately the trend, excuse me, has been people have been leaving their houses a lot more, and in the summer it was a bit busier, but still, I do think people are drawn to that. And subconsciously, I mean, there's, I think, sort of in a black and white or like a binary way of describing it, there's two different ways of looking at it. And one is like, there's sounds that we don't hear that unconsciously affect us in a really negative way. And then you get into, there's actually been like sonic warfare attacks that cause people to become physically ill. And I think that's a really great way to actually evidence something in this like highly negative thing that I never really want to do. But it does show that even if we're not actively hearing something, our bodies are reacting to sound. And I think a lot, like I did this sub-bass only piece and I recorded it during my residency at Pioneer Works. And it's so bassy that you can't actually really hear what's happening most of the time. You just feel the bass shaking you. So it feels really big. And there's nothing happening over 100 hertz. So you're not getting a ton of sonic information in your ears, but it actually gives you a bit of almost like a psychedelic experience. And I did part of the recording with a hydrophone and water, and the water would have standing waves on it and essentially looked cymatic. And if you think about how our bodies are made up of such a large percentage of water, that's what sound is doing to us, essentially, like at least more bassy sound. So in some ways, like, I don't know if this directly answers your question in the way that you would like it to be answered, and feel free to follow up again. But I think inherently, like physicality at minimum is being influenced, and then unconsciously, or I guess maybe even in a more commercial fashion, music is constantly being used to manipulate us in movies and stuff, and we just have this like kind of inherent emotional reaction to it, if that makes sense. Is that kind of what you're wanting to hear?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, like you mentioned, like, you know, music in public spaces, like let's say for a restaurant, if you take the music out of that space, what are you left with? You have like, you know, silverware clanking, and you hear people, you know, chewing or whatever. And so like in that scenario, the sound's actually being used like almost as like a cover up, right? And you mentioned like, you know, negative uses of sound. I'm really curious about how we can go about quantifying or measuring like the positive effects of these sounds, because there's a lot that's already out there in terms of like, you know, how you know, we have all these auditory or sonic stressors in the environment. What about the other way around?
There's actually some really, or at least I guess I feel like I've been in such a time warp. I'm like, last year means 2019. So if I say I did something in person last year, is not true. But in 2019, Stanford was doing a ton of they wanted to integrate a bunch of gamma waves into like the entry point of one of their medical research buildings to calm students, and they were really about this, promoting this idea that like gamma waves or like lower frequency and sub-bass sounds were calming and focusing for people, and helped filter out some of that like higher pitched noise, that the stressor noise. And I feel like there's been actually a lot of research, at least recently, going around about lower frequency stuff being calming and beneficial to the nervous system. And then this whole trending of sound healing that's been happening over the past 5 years, which I know some people who practice sound healing who are really committed to really generous and reciprocal practices and have like a lineage, a basis in that. And then there's a lot of Instagram stuff that happens too, you know. But I think everyone's well intentioned, and at the end of the day, like I know when I first got into sound when I was a kid, and I like saw it move speakers, and I was just like, whoa, what is this thing? It's like the wind, but it's not the wind. It's making sound. It was just like my brain blew up, and I got really excited. And so I think at a baseline, there's totally such positive associations with it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So if anyone has sort of a last minute question, maybe indicate that in the chat.
We actually have
not-
2 questions on YouTube as well.
Oh.
I will type them in chat because people are more visual, and I guess for Zoom people to see it, but I'll read it out as well. Chloe, great presentation. Do you have any advice on how an emerging artist would make the shift from recorded work to interactive/installation work? This question coming from Cole Peters.
Oh, thanks, Cole. I mean, I guess it's really about experimenting. And right now it's like if you have speakers or the ability to make sound happen in your house and can think of different ways to alter that sound based on MIDI even, or just really anything happening, then you're just knocking at that door of interactive installation. And it goes much further than that, of course. But I think starting to think about how your sound could change in space or be with space, or different aspects of it could be activated by somebody entering a room. And if you prototype that with a keyboard or button, and then you can move and you start liking how that sounds, you can move toward like learning Arduino and just getting like a cheap sensor kit, you know, and thinking about how those things interact. Or even like processing is a free tool, and there's really great computer vision integration that's documented. There's also cv.jit libraries to use with Jitter and Max, and you can use your webcam to trigger interaction like through like blob tracking. So if somebody moves or a certain color moves, then it will change something, you know, and start to think about these interactions. I always try to think of the first way to prototype something that doesn't cost any money and uses the tools that already exist, and then move on to like purchasing things, if that makes sense. Because if I can prototype something without, it kind of actually goes back to that question earlier about like, how do you keep up to date on tools? It's like, if I can prototype something without changing what I'm doing already, then I can figure out what I need to change and work toward that direction. And it makes it all a lot less overwhelming.
I think that works well with the next question that's coming up as well. Is it possible to adapt any of these sound worlds to the comfort of one's home to a smaller scale? From Brandon Egon.
I wish I knew which sound worlds. I mean, I think really anything's possible. I do know having a good set of speakers and or a subwoofer is really helpful. That of course costs money and creates sort of a threshold of what people can or cannot invest in. But laptop speakers only play up into a certain amount, and I've actually blown my laptop speakers. I'm one of those people. I've done it. Forgot to put a limiter on, and it's just not as easy to hear, or good headphones. Those help too. But I think pretty much anything we experience in the world can and should be able to be experienced at home. With the spatial audio stuff, it can be a little bit more difficult. I do know that Quark, which is a new Max for Live device, it was how Suzanne Chaney made a quadraphonic album that could be played on a stereo. And it uses, you can use it in Reaper or Max for Live, I think. Those are the only two digital audio workstations. But essentially, you can, if you're interested in spatial audio, you can start with Quad. That's what it does up to. And it can encode Quad to stereo, and then you can send that file to somebody and they can decode it to 4 speakers. And that can then be limited beyond the 4. You can use 8. Obviously, they'd just be mirror images, but that's a start in thinking about sound. And yeah, I mean, I think the first step when you're talking about at home and trying to get things moving around in space or sound worlds happening is either making an aggregate device of multiple Bluetooth speakers. I don't even know if you can really do that, or just having an audio interface, you know, and just getting a few speakers and messing around and seeing what works and what doesn't work and reading up on it.
Very cool. I think that's a good lesson for our students in general, just that kind of line of resourcefulness and thinking.
I mean, it's really just quick. The resourceful thing is like the great thing about going to a school is having resources, and then if you leave the school, you have less access to those resources. And being able to try to make things to different scales, or like prototyping on something that costs no money, is a really super valuable skill. It's actually the thing that's probably served me best out of anything, is being able to problem solve and trying to, instead of telling myself, no, I can't do this, just being like, well, could I finagle this together for a little bit until I can actually do this?
Very good. Todd, do you want to close this out?
Well, I'd like to thank everyone for coming. This was a great talk. I'd like to thank Chloe. I think we could go on for we could go on for a while even. I think that there's but we won't. But I think it's really valuable to hear you know, kind of your experiences and your thoughts on this. And I'm really grateful that you could come and do this. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and thanks to everyone who's been here.
Thank you.
Okay, we are